Creative documentation is not hopefully to give you more work, but by spreading out the palette to include artists, creating a bigger fabric to kind of hold the labor that we all need to do. And as I said in earlier remarks, I was very happy when Dr. Bickelmeyer mentioned that the new focus was meant to clarify our work together and not to create more. So creative documentation, and this is my favorite definition, it serves as another form of knowledge generation that has the potential to shift power by offering a better understanding of creative and cultural practice in communities. And this is by Chris Johnson, who worked for the Center of the Community Development Investments. And this is their official definition of creative documentation, which, as you can see, places creative documentation within a research context. So more than illustrating or simply presenting information in the form of a report, creative documentation produces an artwork or cultural product that is a form of knowledge. And we're going to be working in this with pre-recorded material from two people, Megan Kaminski and Joey Orr, who are on KU's campus. And they represent kind of two ends of the spectrum of how you can work with artists with creative documentation. Joey, as an institutional specialist, brings people together in research-intensive groups to explore ideas. And Megan, working as an individual artist, poet, tends to pick up work which shares her values in a very specific way. So looking at those two will really show us really the two ends of how this work is undertaken, with a lot of room in between. So this was how I started, just thinking about how we've suddenly seen the need and this incredible cry out for arts to help us encounter COVID-19, help us encounter vaccine resistance, an awareness and a recognition of the cultural and community specificity of the needs of this has really grounded us in the awareness of the different kinds of knowledge that art can produce. Here, Gardner's multiple, as it's sometimes said, intelligences, and I prefer practices because it works better both for artists and for all of us who may not identify as artists, but who participate in communication and art making. Gardner's multiple practices kind of map pretty well onto the arts. And you can see how bringing in somebody whose training, methodology, theory, understanding, basis of knowledge is around bodily kinesthetic knowledge is going to improve your understanding of a physical space that you're functioning in. Could be an interesting place to bring people in to think about how to explore a community, what would be natural gathering places, where would be places that you would tend to stay away from. A naturalist understanding living things and reading nature, spatialization. So you can see how these map onto the various types of artistic knowledge production. Here is what the CDC kind of presented the world with, as putting the arts and culture sort of in the middle with the CDC guidance on one side and demand and uptake on the other side. It doesn't always work that way, but their basis of saying that artists needed to be reached out, and this is something that we all already know, but it serves as a good reminder that the arts turn information into narratives, images, and symbols that resonate deeply and move past intellectual arguments to embody dialogue, knowing, and action. Artists and culture bearers have long been translators and trusted messengers of vital information in communities. And at the most recent individual breakout session with Janeth from the One Dot Nation, I was really struck by the centrality of the requirement for cultural understanding. So creative documentation working with an artist can and will include things like strategic planning, asset mapping, staff and stakeholder engagement, things that are very familiar within community engaged scholarship, but it's also designed to increase the types of knowledge generated from research. So what more can we get? What kind of information could we generate from this that would let us perhaps feel and not just understand, to know differently, to expand our reach, to increase transparency, to increase assessment options, and create clarity of vision and engage with sustainable practices. And for my own particular work, this is how it's different necessarily than just simply working with an artist. It's very research-centered. The documentation and research are at the core. There's a deeper engagement, more connections based on mutuality and value, and it recognizes the knowledge creation of art practices. So for me, often working with smaller nonprofit organizations, the things that I'm really hoping to help them avoid by creating a cohesive strategy for telling their story is we're really trying to avoid things like expensive one-off costs for advertising or others to produce materials for grants or for communicating with our stakeholders. And that stressful sort of how to tell our story that is pretty crushing on, it kind of leaves everybody on high alert, and nobody's quite sure what to do. If it's everybody's feeling like they have to do it, we have to tell our story, we have to get on social media, we need to do these things, but what things, which story, how do we tell the story? And that often involves volunteers working beyond their skill set, and then the accidental exploitation of artists through late placements or lack of work, lack of resources, or poor fits between research and accessible outcome, information, or outreach. So you want to get the information to a community at risk, you put it online, but they don't have any access to the internet or to digital services, you've missed your community. So an artist's work treated like an illustration and not knowledge creation. Those are all things we're trying to avoid. And this is an example, we'll come back around to it. I wanted to give a local example that's a little bit later on in this talk. And we'll be taking a look at what happened behind the scenes with the Pollinator Project and how the Pollinator Project came back after a few years away from Kansas. So these are the two folks that I'm going to be doing some pre-recorded materials with. I have it video on my computer, so hopefully it won't be too meta. But both Megan and Joey operate here in the KU ecology as people who really engage with and underscore their connection to and attention with their local community. So I'm actually going to go over to that video. So Joey Orr is a Carnegie Mellon funded position here at KU, which is designed as a research position to connect people. So he's going to describe what he does a little bit, and we'll go from there.
I work at the Spencer Museum of Art at the University of Kansas, and it's a pretty specific job. So I am serving a community, but the community that I serve is the research community at the. And so, I think a lot of what this kind of community engaged work means is just knowing people, actually spending time being together and finding out what the common ground is. So for instance, I'm supposed to be serving researchers across the sciences and humanities and bringing visual artists in who have been working on the same issues or sets of concepts for long periods of time, so that when we make inquiries together, we're all really invested in it, even though we're invested in it from different perspectives, from different methods, or for different reasons. And of course, that takes a lot of time and resources to create. It's funny that you asked to start with kind of what we were doing and think back to earlier work, because my very first curatorial project where I cut my teeth was back in 2000. And I ran a 5-year grassroots community art program called Shed Space. And I was living in Atlanta, and Atlanta is just a sprawl city. And a lot of the transitioning neighborhoods were undergoing some real inequitable kind of property exchanges that were racially and class sort of exclusive. And no one was dealing with the context. And so I went around and had people donate the use of their sheds in their backyards for a week through an entire month over the summer. And artists would do installations in those shed spaces. And they were addressing the issues that were going on in the city that no one was really addressing. And the way that I actually got support for the program is because the arts organizations and some of the other civic organizations were not ever reaching those audiences or touching on those issues, but that's actually where the funding was. And so I ended up getting a lot of indirect support that way. But the reason I go back to that moment is because that was definitely not an academic or scholarly kind of project, but it was a project that emphasized relationship building and knowing who's in your community and who to bring together when you're trying to do a particular kind of thing. And one of the things I think will resonate is that, what artists aren't going to do is illustrate other people's work for them or communicate out other people's work. What artists can do is produce a different kind of value around a common subject. There's a lot of different ways to think through things that we value. And sometimes that can be done through a very traditional kind of lecture or public program. Sometimes it's sitting down and having a meal together. Sometimes it's a hike through the prairie, and so just being open to, not always falling back on the kind of protocols that we always use, because when we communicate in different ways, we also are able to have different kinds of conversations with different people. The traditional way for a visual art curator work would be that I would curate an exhibition based on my scholarly expertise. And then I would work with an education department to translate that expertise out to a general public. And that is not how institutions work any longer. Now the curator is an access point in the institution so that people can author their own questions given the resources of the museum. So I think of the exhibition as just one component of a larger exercise. And there's the exhibition, and there's the hike, and there's the meal, and there's a lecture, and there's all these things that are contributing to a more robust kind of community engagement. I think sometimes when you bring people together who know different kinds of things and use different kinds of languages, there's this expectation that we can't understand on other people's terms, especially in academia, because disciplines tend to be so siloed. But actually, it's an opportunity to provide a different perspective on the same thing you've been thinking about, but under a different set of terms.
And is there anything that you do to help foster that opportunity?
It depends on who all I'm working with, because every collaboration has a different set of expectations and demands.
Anything in general? You can say no, but I'm wondering.
No, it's fine.
Certainly more time is always better than less time.
If a group of collaborators are tending to default to one perspective, I just name it. It's like this group can make any decision this group needs to make, so long as we all understand the terms on which we're making our decisions. So the group can discover together what paths they want to create and how. And I would love for there to be a lot of space for different kinds of thinking, but all I can do is sort of make it clear as I see it, what seems to be happening and how we seem to be making our decisions.
Like signposts, like here we are now, here we are in month 2, looks like we're here, that kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah, and making explicit how I see what we're basing our decisions on. So if those things are inequitable, then inequity can become a subject of the conversation. Just to make sure that things aren't being buried and implicit in the kind of collaborations.
So I want to stop there and address that for a moment, because I think Joey said something very important. So a few different things. One, and I'm going to walk through a number of the people that on KU's campus you could reach out to for collaborative assistance, to find out who else in the community is working on your ideas, who might you connect with, how might you find funding. Joey is a wonderful resource, but you'll notice he said something there that's very specific to collaborators and yet incredibly helpful in the kind of ethical creative documentation that we want to be doing. Because Joey mentioned that he names it when he sees something, so there are no implicit or unconscious bias going into the project. That if you need to say it, if he's seeing it come up, so it really serves as a wonderful opportunity to create clarity around your purpose, to create clarity around your hoped for goals and outcomes. And although it isn't a phrase that's used in the art world, to address those serious questions that are addressed in the sociological theory of change. This idea that in every interaction, we should be trying to find a way to rebalance or restructure power. What Joey does when he's working with collaborators serves as a powerful reminder that another person looking at your materials, another person looking at your perspective can point things out to you that may get lost. I first met Joey when he did his inaugural piece at the Spencer Art Museum, which was around soil. And he did a beautiful job of bringing together scientists and artists to talk about how this material makes up our world and what we make with this material. He also came into our department to discuss what the research initiative was and to invite scholars from our department to work with him. And that whole arena at the Spencer Museum, it's a wonderful place to start some of your researches. So certainly that is a fantastic resource. So I wanted to note that first. And I will also say that Joey's position at KU is unique. There is not another one in the United States that's funded in this way and that has this purpose at a university art museum. So we are very fortunate to have him operating in that space. And he also has some really interesting new projects coming up that you should definitely keep your eye out for. So just a couple more pieces. Megan, I first met actually on a graduate student, PhD student committee. She brought me on because our work sort of intersects in questions of placemaking and environmental pressures. A lot of my own personal work is invested in, well, like a deep love of my own home in Michigan. But I've also seen Megan out and about. She's basically impossible to miss because she's at sunrise, she's doing birds, she's doing poetry. She's very, very deeply connected into the fabric of our community here in Lawrence. And although she is working on a number of KU-based projects like The Big Idea with Katie Batza and a number of other researchers, she's also involved in Kansas Humanities. She's involved with the library downtown. So she is a wonderful person and has offered herself up as a person to connect you with writers and poets of all types and stripes. She talks about that a little bit in this. I'll play a little bit from her.
Well, I'm a poet and an associate professor in the Department of English here at KU. And my work really is at the intersection of the environmental arts and humanities, and also kind of touching into, I'm hesitant to maybe say the medical humanities and arts, because I'm really interested in a poetics of healing. But as someone operating from a queer and disability informed practice, I'm also very wary of the medicalization of some of these ideas. So, but yeah, so I think my work on the intersection of environmental humanities and arts and medical humanities and arts. And I'm really interested in helping people connect to their ecosystem.
So she froze. She's interested in people's connections with their ecosystems is the thing that she was saying. And so I'll just point out here before we go on, sorry, I got them in both in bad poses, that Megan's perspective on working with groups and communities is very different than Joey's. And these two outside posts are really they're really the furthest reaches of the kinds of relationships you can have that are still strong, supported, ethical, doing all the great things that we want to see those things doing, non-extractive on both sides, not getting everything all mixed up and not distracting any kind of community organization from their core mission. But with Megan, you have somebody who is very driven by her core values and by her research and seeking mutuality with those groups that can also support that, even finding it in some very surprising spaces.
My areas of research are poetry, and that I write poetry, and I also do a lot of work in eco writing and eco arts practices, and that's probably where my those two places are where the intersections come out in community engaged work, public facing work, and I'm really interested in how we can connect to our ecosystem as a place to look for knowledges for how we might live in the world, how we can grieve and heal after loss, and how we can realign thinking towards non-extractive and non-exploitative relationships. So I'm really interested, because I'm here in Lawrence and have been for 14 years now. I'm really interested in our specific ecosystem and thinking about the tallgrass prairie and the Kansas River watershed and where we are specifically with that. So the projects that I'm working on now, the current projects, would be around thinking about poetry as a way to connect and expand our ideas of kinship and community, thinking ecologically. Some of that takes the form of public workshops, readings through libraries. I did an installation for the Tarbell Arts Center and led a children's workshop through their Big Reads program. And I've been doing actually a lot of children's and teens workshops lately, and visited with Oklahoma State University's School of Education, actually, and did some programming for them too. So
was that through the Kansas Humanities Project?
No, that was a professor at Oklahoma State contacted me about my research and invited me to give a talk. So that, and then I've also been doing these major projects through the Humanities Kansas. So the most recent was the Words of a Feather project.
Now, the Words of a Feather was a fascinating collection, an edited edition of poetry, which actually brought together a vast number of poets of color across the state of Kansas. And it's one of the things that Kansas Humanities was so excited to learn upon working with Megan, because she knows all of these poets, and it's more than just the top 5 or 6 most recognized poets in the state of Kansas, that they were able to draw from a very deep and diverse pool of people. So her primary recommendation in terms of finding people that you want to work with is to reach out to somebody who really knows that area. Maybe they're not the person you're going to work with, but they know a whole lot of other people, and they can connect you. They can start giving you those names that might not be, the top 3 on your Google search. They might not be the ones that are most familiar to you from looking at, Kansas poets necessarily, right? I just want to find Megan's website very quickly. So I'll just walk you through this a little bit, because I'd like you to see it's often the case that artists will actually, having reached a certain point where they understand themselves well enough, will really be able to tell you what their work is about. And by taking a look at it and by sort of following their work, reading their work, you can see if they're the right person for you to connect with for this project, or if they could help with another form of connecting, because you need to find somebody who works in writing, but perhaps has a slightly different perspective. So these are her projects. This is her website that's here. She has a lot of really fascinating works that are going on. Just one of my favorites, not quite out yet, is this Prairie Divination Pack, which is a tarot card based on things that you find in the tall grass prairie. So Megan's work, she goes on in this interview, and we'll see more of it later. But with her, the thing you're going to want to do is ensure that you're discovering mutuality with her ongoing work. Not only is she looking for collaborations where it deepens and enhances her research, but collaborations which, really get at her heart's core values, which she's very straightforward about right on her website. So it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to find out what artists are fascinated by, interested in. And even if you don't necessarily have a lot of financial resources to offer them, the opportunity to work with people on the things that are closest to their heart is incredibly compelling and can still be done without being at all extractive. We'll go back to just a little bit more of Megan, and then we'll come back.
Which was a do-it-yourself humanities project, in the sense that I solicited poems and edited a collection of poems from Kansas-based and Kansas-related authors, poems that would help people connect to the natural world, and poems that were about interactions with birds. And that was so successful that I proposed, they asked me to do a workshop around it, and I was able to loop my colleague and friend Molly Zahn into that project, and that's what you were at earlier today. She's an expert, but doesn't do work in this area for her research. So it was this really beautiful way where we could collaborate, and she could bring this kind of personal, I don't know, I was going to say passion, but I think it's so connected to her values too, and bring things together that way. I'm also doing a Listening to Place project for them next year, which is going to be a series of talks, I guess, and workshops around Kansas for nonprofit cultural agencies.
That's about listening, specifically.
Listening to plays, yes, about poetry and the natural world, and how we can see poetry and writing as a practice to see and connect and live in good relation.
So I'm going to pause there and introduce another example. This one from St. Louis, funded by a Catalyst initiative. And many of these projects that I'm going to be discussing share funding sources, for better or for worse, sometimes for worse. So the Catalyst initiative, round 2, came out of St. Louis. And in this one, and I don't know this artist except by reputation, and I don't know Magdalene St. Louis, but this is one of the kind of reports on creative documentation and these works that have come out of a number of these processes after, well, we'll talk about creative placemaking in a little bit. So Magdalene St. Louis offers a 2-year residential program for women who have survived lives of prostitution, trafficking, addiction, and life on the streets. So their work together focused on using Joan's artistic practice of constructing public narratives and increased visibility for an organization serving a population in crisis. Their story over a year of collaboration is one of reimagining outcomes, navigating profound institutional changes, and discovering new strategies for successful collaborations. This is included in the materials that I gave you, but it's sort of giving you a sense of who she is and how she works. So she's a theater artist, educator, and a founding artistic director of that Uppity Theater Company in St. Louis. When they work together, it kind of goes through how it was set up, how it changed, and what those shifts were. As you can see, their idea was they hoped that as the women began to find physical and emotional stability and health, they would also find healing in sharing their stories and eventually establish themselves as a self-sustaining acting ensemble, performing their stories to other communities, so that the artistic process and the embedded sort of artist residency was to have an outcome both of individual participation for the women there, and also of an external public exhibition, which would show the result of this process of the women's growth in their lives, and potentially also provide them with meaningful engagement and other options in there. So there's a lot of restructuring in the process. And the thing that I wanted to point out as we see this, a lot of the restructuring happened when the board changed, the executive director changed. There were some other dilemmas in funding, and they had a number of things that shifted. And the part of the story that came out of this is that because the person who had brought her in was the person who had left, the arrangement that would have perhaps helped bring cohesion between the residency, the new initiative, and the changed board was lost. And so one of the points that we'll come back to in terms of how to construct mutuality and value is about consistent communication and attempting to do kind of what Joey was suggesting, which is not leave anything implicit. If you see it, say it. If you think that something's happening, if you feel like sides are drifting apart. So her question was, how can an artist balance being in service to both a population in need and an organization facing major institutional changes? They embedded the artist, and how can an artist offer support in these moments of transition? And so these are like little pieces with identity blinded that the community made there. And there were a number of shifts along the way, and this, for a successful outcome, focuses on the need for flexibility. So while the board was initially focused very deeply on a fundraising initiative, Joan decided or saw that what the women needed were something else, and they were able to prepare a theatrical presentation for the fundraising activity and have it be successful both as a financial outcome and as an artistic process. So reading these and giving yourself the chance to think about how some of the structural questions or structural challenges that arise in some of these various case studies might map onto your project or the project that you are proposing or interested in undertaking with your community or with an artist might really help to think about how to strengthen that relationship really even before it begins. So this Magdalene one is really interesting because of the challenges that were faced. And the the complexities of this project didn't sink it, because people were able to stay flexible, because people were able to find mutuality, and because people were able to find mutual values. More than likely, community engagement with or without an artist is going to be threatened by any kind of a mix between conflict of interests and fatigue, or just the desire not to see it, especially in some of the more complicated cultural questions that surround all of these. But being able to stay flexible with in-points and out-points and outcomes, being able to create mutuality and create mutual value, maybe beyond the project, but connecting it to the fuller lives of the artists that you've involved in it, the community members that you've involved in it, will help sort of ride out the waves of what are likely to be some bumps in the road. Because when Joey mentioned, if you see it, you say it, those are hard conversations. If you discover that you're in a collaboration with someone and their values or their intentions are different, it has to be explored. And in order to do that, the best way to start: flexibility, mutuality, seeking value between the various people who you're working with. So a little tiny bit more with Megan. Okay, so I just want to go quickly back to what Megan mentioned at first, working inside of the healing arts. This is a really interesting conversation. She's going to discuss going to work with some first-year med students on somatic exercises so that they can understand how their patients are feeling.
And talked with first-year medical students about poetry and about poetry as a practice, so they could really check in with themselves and connect. I do a lot of work with somatics too, so really thinking about our embodied emotions and how our body reflects what's going on within us if we listen to it. So a lot of that was helping these future doctors to connect with their own emotions and feelings so they could also help their patients do that. Marson, who is the Dean of Clinical Teaching, so is responsible for training the future.
She just goes over in this section how she was brought into the medical school and why she was brought in. And the short version of that is that the person who brought her in, who's the dean, had read Words of a Feather and was fascinated by this and really wanted to bring this energy and interest and knowledge creation into her first year classroom for the med students. Doctors. And so just go forward a little tiny bit.
Would be willing to do a class visit. So she invited me to speak with the first year medical students, which was pretty great.
Do a thing that I love to do when I can, as soon as I can, and that is invite the critic in the room. So creative documentation is a broad process. I want to give a little bit of feedback and information about some of the ways that it grew and some of the ways that it did receive funding. So community development investments as a program had it's a sort of a set of research strategies, and it's created as sort of a laboratory with various stakeholders and a range of philanthropic, academic, and market-driven interests. That's pretty important to remember. Many place-based community development organizations were growing increasingly interested in the idea of creative placemaking and partnering with arts and culture, but a very small number actually felt as though they knew how to do it well. So creative placemaking has a number of funding drivers. Art Place America was one of them. I just want to go over briefly a short history of that. So Art Place America and Policy Link both fund large community development projects. Some of those have been very positive for their communities. Others have been less positive for their communities, and they have been less positive in what it turns out to be fairly typical or fairly symptomatic ways, I should say. And those symptomatic ways, I'm using this slide, how not to be the walrus, the honey bear, or the Instagram wings. And what happens in creative placemaking on occasionally is that you end up, and I'll bring the critic into the room here, with this very similar development issues, including accurate representation of the community who's there, transparency of funding or outcome, various kinds of washings, including greenwashing or red washing, And so the relationship to creative placemaking really has to be interrogated for its ethics and its integrity, to make sure that those pieces are in place firmly, that you're paying attention to the needs of the communication of the community there, and that everybody's pretty ethical about and transparent about why they're there, where the money is coming from, where the money is going. And there are people who have been trying to get creative placemaking to live up to its potential, among them Roberto Badeo, who's quoted here. He's the city public cultural affairs manager of the city of Oakland. And out of that came the program, the CDI, the Community Development Program. They were created from a grant from Art Place America, but with a specific purview to connect research and documentation to the creative placemaking projects, and to bring in artists and community members, and to constantly question whether that theory of change, whether the practice of ethical production of knowledge is being attended to. And so the lessons from the CDI program, many of which are included in those massive links, they recommend starting in this way, and I think that this is the great way to start: identify a common language and shared goals with artists, increase transparency and consistency in communication, demonstrate more patience during the initial pilot phase of a program, a precursor to deeper and longer term partnerships, trust the process and be flexible with respect to deadlines and deliverables, and view partnerships as mutually beneficial, with both sides sharing their creativity and resources. Again, just the challenges to creative placemaking, and much of this comes from the need to really make sure that we are looking at this from an ethical approach. How well do they understand how their goals impact the lives of the indigenous populations they are committed to serving? Meeting this challenge entails reaching out to, awakening, and mobilizing the often nascent community spirits of local populations. One byproduct is often the emergence of self-realization on the parts of local communities, and this can express itself as a desire to generate internal, as opposed to external, resources that could benefit community members. This emergence of self-realization is often expressed in terms of creative placekeeping, as opposed to creative placemaking. And this is actually very interesting here locally, because if any of you are familiar with the Arts Corridor, the East 9th project that was funded by ArtSpace a number of years ago, this exact question emerged and ended up, and you can see some of these materials here, as a number of people locally criticizing the project of the ArtSpace East Corridor in order to try to maintain greater access and visibility and space for the people who actually live in that community. And so there is a lot of local information if you're curious about how this project affected the local populations, the conversations around it, what creative placemaking looks like from both sides. There's a lot right here in our own backyard. I want to point out another project that's right here in our own backyard that I think is a beautiful example of creative placemaking, of working with an artist, and of research documentation that connects a local artist, Dave Lowenstein, with the Spencer Research Museum, or Spencer Museum. It commissioned the Pollinators mural back in 2007, but it was on the side of a building that was sold and demolished in 2015. In 2017, Return of the Pollinators, which was a community project with lots of people involved, and involves here, as you can see, local African-American, or not necessarily local, African-American individuals, as well as pollinator plants and pollinator insects, pollinator animals in this local area. And sort of right here in the middle is the challenges to pollinators. And you can see the sort of attempt to build a barrier between the challenges and the pollinators. So this is a really interesting place, and it involved a lot of public, intensive community-based process to create the mural, public input meetings in February 2017, and culminating in community painting days in May of 2017. So we have a lot of interesting opportunities to see how this work works here, and also to understand that the timeline, the need for community participation, and the need for, again, flexibility, mutuality, and mutually created value is very, very important. I'd like to pop over to how to start. And here I'd like to introduce you all, and it's in the links that I sent, to the Center for Service Learning's Community Engagement Toolkit. And this is a really fantastic resource for your organization. If you want to start with your organization, again, creating a clear plan with your artist or with your organization to see what it is you would like to do. Each one of these areas has a number of prompts to work through with your group. So you can see what kind of work you'd like to do. One thing I recommend is take a look at this wheel, ways to work towards social change, and think about which of these things would you want to involve an artist in. A number of artists could be very good at helping across a variety of these, but you might want to pick from these one area to start working with an artist to see if you have options and who you might want to work with. So see within your organization, who would this be? Develop a point person, get a good, flexible, low bar communication strategy, and see if you can begin to work a little bit more deeply with your organization to define some areas you might want to work with an artist to create greater transparency, to create greater chances to communicate, or to create greater opportunities to engage with your audience and engage with your community. And Jamela, if you wanted to jump in with anything, not to put you at all on the spot, but if you wanted to jump in with anything specific in the toolbox where people could start, there are some really wonderful things in the toolkit to help different various organizations and different types work within themselves before they reach out to look for an artist. Is there anything here that you would specifically recommend that people take a look at as they're working with their organization?
So I was going to note, I'm actually going to share the opportunity a little bit because a couple of my colleagues, Valerie and Kate, have actually worked much more closely on the toolbox, and then I can layer on. And so I think what you noted, though, that for the most part, it is a model to think about kind of where we are in regards to opportunities in a process to work with partners or in partnership, both community and community academic. So from engaging, assessing, planning, acting, evaluating, sustaining. And I think the other part is being cognizant of where we're starting. So it's secular, meaning that it's ongoing, and that depending on where our partnerships are, we might be jumping in at different spaces or what the needs of the communities are as well. And I think the only other thing that we would know, and Kate can jump in if she would like, is that oftentimes when we're entering spaces, like what's that role or that contribution point is helpful, and being very intentional in that. And so I'll tag Kate to talk a little bit more just really quickly. She's anything she wants to say about the social change wheel, but then Valerie, if you maybe want to lead quickly in regards to pulling into the toolkit sections and just how it's set up with the exemplars and content then that links to the Community Toolbox, which is another resource with the University of Kansas, the Center for Community Health and Development, that provides practical information.
It's an absolutely wonderful resource. The prompts on here are just fantastic.
Yeah, Valerie did a really great job putting all this together. So I will give her all the props for the site. In terms of the social change wheel, I do want to give appropriate props to Campus Compact. Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact are the folks that put this together. I just made the graphic with KU-like colors. So I think that this is a really valuable tool, regardless of who you're working with, whether it's a community partner, student groups, faculty, staff, and really kind of thinking about the various ways that you can engage. I think it's a really helpful visual for that. But Valerie, I do want to tag you for kind of the different tools. I know that me and Alyssa Francis in the Student Involvement Leadership Center, we've used this as we're thinking about student organizations and how they're working to create social change. So I think this is a really, really flexible and multi-use tool.
Yes, thank you. So I appreciate all the credit, but the website's a collaborative activity with students. And just to briefly talk about its format, if you could just scroll up just slightly on the page, you'll see that there is our model. So the model of the toolkit is to engage, reflect, assess, plan, act, sustain, and then communicate and celebrate. And throughout the process, we're thinking about engagement and we're thinking about reflection. So as you go through the different pages of the toolkit, it'll bring up, again, like what did we mean by, these different terms in the plan? And then actual examples of, hey, this is how other developed initiatives have done this. And then we end with resources. I know that, this is a living website. And so we're, constantly looking at updating it, providing more information and resources. And so what we've been working on this winter is our latest update, which is really looking at social action as our lens, and considerations with social justice and resources in that regard. So that is a very quick overview.
Valerie, where here are the examples you were just listing? Are they in?
Yes. So if you look under like the toolkit box, and let's say you click on assess, and then scroll down to, so those are going through the different phases of the model. And if we were go to assess, we start with key questions to consider, some core activities, and then we go through a reflection prompt, a social justice prompt. We're always trying to build context, and then using assessment and the social change wheel to take action. There's 3 examples listed. And so we kind of tie in how to think about it through the social change wheel and give different examples.
So here we're looking at the community building, socially responsible daily behavior, and advocacy, raising awareness.
Yep. And we move through the entire social change wheel throughout the plan, just giving examples, illustrative examples. Yep.
One of the things I really love about this is that you can use these with your own organization, or you could use it with the artists that you want to work with, because it helps you have these reflection prompts. It gives you a chance to think about where we're going. You don't have to make it up from whole cloth. And the majority of these questions are asking exactly those questions that are the right ones about who's got the power, who's got the organization, where are things moving, how can we make sure that we're focusing on equity and focusing on justice in these organizations and communications. So this toolkit is a wonderful place to start, getting connected with various other people. I know we have half an hour left, so I want to move over to how to connect with artists, how to find them, the care and feeding. But I want to just thank very much Jomela and Kate and Valerie for walking us through this toolkit. I hope really that it's something, I feel like it's something that could be used in almost every department on the campus. We could even use it when we're thinking about how to map out our departmental resources for our students. There's quite a bit here to be discovered in terms of creating conversations. And I find that the prompts themselves really actually do provide a very active space of equity, because everybody can look at the prompts equally and bring their own ideas to it. They're not really being generated from me or from my own perspective. They're being generated in order to let us consider them. And especially if you're bringing new collaborators in, that's a wonderful place of openness, because neutrality sometimes looks like openness, but it's a wonderful place of openness to really try to connect with the things that they are hoping also to receive. So I want to walk you through a few places of where you can find artists in Kansas and Missouri. First, Kansas Humanities, kind of fantastic. It's one of those do a little or do a lot with a little. They do get a lot done. You can request speakers, you can find who they are, you can look for the grants. There are cultural preservation grants, speakers bureaus. You can request speakers, you can look at their Kansas stories. There's a lot going in Kansas Humanities that even if you're outside of KU, these are wonderful resources and opportunities. Regional art opportunities are usually just that, only open to artists within a specific region. I don't totally understand that. That's not something that happens in other research areas, but there are a lot of regional art organizations. I also wanted to point out Kansas, the Commons, we have Emily here, the Health, Humanities, and Arts research has been an incredible connective tissue, especially during the pandemic when, in-person red hot research couldn't really happen. And so this was, I think, an absolutely fantastic place for people to meet and see each other and get out of our silos of the type that Joey was talking about. And I know that at least in academia and probably outside of academia, we are definitely all familiar with. And it looks like there's a few workshops coming up a research workshop, identifying your roles on collaborative research teams. There's some other workshops, asking good questions, amplifying collaboration on research teams. So I would definitely, if you're spinning up a research project, I would definitely attend some of these. These are wonderful places to get to meet people. I think, and Emily, you can perhaps jump in here and clarify, give you a second to unmute yourself. Are the sessions recorded, and can people find them if they want to see who was where and who said what?
For the most part, they are recorded unless whoever the speaker that time is has asked us not to do that. And the tricky part is that right now, as you can see, we're still on our old website, but we are in the queue to be approved for the new website. So right now there are videos on that site, but I don't yet have them uploaded to the new one. So for the time being, watch at your heart's content.
Great. And there are seed grants here. In addition, there's the Big Ideas grant initiative that I don't have pulled up here. I just wanted to point out also a few other sites. Here we go. This is an interesting one. This is Arts KC. It's a guide to arts and culture. It's an artist directory. You can sort of search it by discipline, content, genre. You can sort of see who's doing what where. These are primarily Kansas City area artists. However, it does reach some of the larger Kansas and Missouri area. Another place, the Lawrence Arts Center, pretty much every artist who comes in and around Lawrence has something to do with the Lawrence Arts Center. These people know just about everyone and very often are so happy to sit down and talk to you. And I 100% could not and would not want to make it through this without talking straight up about the Kansas libraries. If you have not met the librarians at the University of Kansas, you are sadly missing a wonderful opportunity. Every one of them is so fascinating and has such an interesting, especially the research librarians have such a fascinating purview. And you can see here who is going to be the right person for you to work with, connect with, or begin to ask questions with in terms of what they research, who they know, because across the university, not a larger biography there, across the university, many times the research librarians are the people who are connecting people who have a specific interest. So for instance, here, Joshua Bullock is very interested in open access, non-copyrighted materials. We have librarians in pretty much every single field. So the KU libraries are a wonderful place to start, not necessarily artists themselves, but certainly people who know how to connect people within research fields. So I would strongly recommend the KU libraries as an opportunity to see who's out there, see what's happening. Just another couple of quick things. What you're gonna find in a number of the materials that I gave you are guides, field guides, and they're long and they're complicated, and some of them will be useful and some of them won't. In terms of building sustainable partnerships, they largely say the same kinds of things. Understand the values, try to find mutuality, discover flexibility, try to keep your communications open, and try to develop as much clarity and transparency between what you intend and your outcomes and your goals. Okay, so I would love, I did have another spot that, I wanted to show you these two things too. So the Kansas Creative Arts Industries Commission has a few different grants that they have, which might be of interest to some. Reimagined spaces, publicly accessible spaces for purpose of artistic use in public programming. And there's other grant making opportunities to connect with organizations and groups. Much of the funding for community and cultural change programs does not come from the arts. The majority of it is coming from other projects and programs, but there are opportunities within the arts. I was going to share a little bit of Call to Walls. There are things inside of the arts that also can help bolster these initiatives. One last thing, just wanted to show you Joey's research profile. He really is a really fantastically special person to have on campus. And if you have questions, reaching out to anybody at the number of the libraries, but Megan has agreed to be a person who we can use as a point person. If you have questions about poets, Joey has agreed to be a wonderful resource for anybody who may have questions. Claudia says, I appreciated your comment about embracing and learning from failure. Can you give an example of how to embrace this idea when working with a community partner? I can. And I mean, failure. It's kind of complicated because in this instance, I would say the failure that I would point to was short-term, recoverable failure. But if it hadn't been addressed, it could have converted into a non-recoverable failure. So in terms of thinking about failure, I could actually probably point, we could point to the local arts corridor, although that's a little complicated because I wasn't directly engaged with that. I really mostly know it from the outside. I can tell you, well, this is not necessarily one to learn from. The Arts Place Initiative put out a really, really surprising final report that they believed that some of their placemaking initiatives had been used to, well, I can show you the report, that some of their placemaking initiatives had been used to paper over a vast move of resources and materials outside of the community of care that they were hoping. They unintentionally engaged, well, wasn't necessarily unintentional. They ended up engaging more with developers and less with communities. They ended up underwriting the needs, not underwriting the needs of their local community, but only underwriting the needs of development. That was an unrecoverable process in some instances. The local one actually managed somewhat to be recovered. There was both expansion and a deeper connection with some of the local artists' works and materials. Wasn't always necessarily successful. Another interesting failure that I experienced in works was really fascinating because I remember we were working with, in this instance, it was a group of, it wasn't the soldiers, but it was their wives. And in working with the wives of the soldiers, we discovered that they wanted less to understand what their husbands had experienced in combat. This was sort of one of the points that only people who'd been in combat could understand what the combat was. Their wives wanted to understand, their partners, but in this case it was all wives, wanted to understand why they couldn't connect with them. So while we were at the outset going for the identified need on the part of the wives and husbands, that the husbands felt they could only turn to the remainder, the other people who had been in combat, they could never turn to their partner when they were struggling. In fact, their partners did not necessarily want to know, and the veterans did not necessarily want to share what had happened in combat. What turned out to be more important was helping them establish pathways of communicating and talking around it. So we discovered, in fact, that we were able to let the veterans share a single image or an object, and then we would practice helping them move on to a deeper connection and communication with their partner, instead of a connection and communication with that moment in their past, which both parties felt that had driven them apart. That's kind of a long, complex answer, but it was a film project that was also a writing project that was designed to help veterans with severe, specific forms of PTSD connect with their community of care around them. And initially, one thing had been identified, but it turns out underneath that was this greater desire not to replay a memory that their partner could never be involved in, but to create a new one. So we ended up using these almost totemic objects, photographs, objects themselves, and then letting that be something they could connect on and then form a new bond away from that. So that was sort of a failure of our first one because we found ourselves very frustrated by trying to get everybody to do the thing they'd said they wanted to do. It turns out it wasn't what they wanted to do. It turns out what they wanted was to connect, and that what we needed to do was to find a way to let them acknowledge the separation and then help come back together. We were working with psychologists, we were working with trauma-informed folks. I was there as a listener, as I so often am as a filmmaker. And so it was by the process of sitting in that room, seemingly having a successful time of the veterans communicating with their partners what combat had been like, that let nobody satisfied. It was worse than before in a way, more disconnection. To see that failure and then to say, well, what are we missing? And it was only by seeing that failure. And really, we only saw that failure by looking at the tapes. Because everybody could say, yes, that feels okay, but you could see on their face and their body language. But it was by doing that, we could move on to the next stage. I don't know if that's necessarily helpful, but I really do believe that it was part of what allowed slowing down to do the documentary, slowing down to do the documentation of all of this, allowed the therapists and the trauma supporters to find a new goal, to define a new outcome as sort of that flexibility and that mutuality. Thank you for that question. Let's see. Thank you for sharing. The example integrated a lot of web-based examples of documentation. Do you have examples of how to use the online platforms as multimodal or when other modes is helpful to creative documentation? How do you connect across modes or determine the most appropriate communication mode for creative documentation? That's fantastic. So a few of the CDI materials that I gave indicate or utilize some examples. And in fact, let me just find it right here. In fact, the one that I was mentioning at the outset, the mall project, the medical mall project, was largely not digital. The project, that particular project, was largely analog and installed, and it was about people moving around and between different places. In fact, what I'd love to show you, I would like to show you a little piece of a video project called Question Bridge. It's a very beautiful piece that, well, I'll just show you, you'll see. And it's got, this is a digital piece, and I'll show another piece, but this one is an installation. And in this installation, the individuals who are there, you can sort of see the different areas, record their answers to these series of prompts. But the prompts are actually created by the other people in the installation, creating a conversation. And this question bridge is multi-community or multi-generational around these questions. Black males ask questions, other
I have
Black
a question
males.
for you. What does it mean to you to be a Black male?
What is your purpose in life? How do we reclaim our communities?
At what point do young people stop respecting their elders? What are you doing to make your world, your community, a better place?
How do we break the cycle?
Why do so many of us live in the present tense? What is the last word that we can remember you by as a Black man? For your last day on this earth, what is the word that we can remember you by?
On the last word as a Black man that I would like to be remembered by is warrior.
Sincere, motivated, dedicated, proper balance, family-oriented, honesty.
And as a student of Baha'u'llah, he's seen the light and changed. Creative, because if you don't know, man, I'm the creator.
Thoughtful,
Responsibility.
Empowerment.
getting submitted to orders.
Father, I think, is the greatest thing a Black man can be. Father.
I want to ask you a question, especially to my Black men out there. Do you feel that you were deprived from your father if your father wasn't in your life? Do you blame your mother because she just wanted?
It's an incredible piece. The thing I would like to point out is, while it is digital, it also combines a few different things. So you have each person able to receive and transmit these materials at sort of almost making a direct portal between individuals. And then that's their experience, but the documentation of all of this, because of the way it's edited, because of the choices, because of the build, the musicality of the edit, really becomes a knowledge creator in its own right. To give another example from the CDI, let me see if I can find. So the physical ones definitely more common than more common but harder to find, right? It's harder to find them outside of their place. In fact, in Katrina, is it Katrina? No, in the Emily moderated, was it Katrina? She was showing the things that she'd found in that home, receipts, pieces, and she photographed them and made them something she could project, and that's how they'll be findable online. So physical objects from these communities can be really difficult to find from when you're doing outreach, but there are places where, let me see if I can just find, where the recommendations and the process themselves, there we go, this is great. Okay, so the Jackson Medical Arts Foundation is the one that I was referencing right at the outset. So this is inside of it. This is community development. This is the Jackson Medical Mall Foundation. This video is part of the documentation that they did. Their arts and culture approach combined a variety of different opportunities, including the artists that they collaborated with made and created a physical art cart so this Prosperity Street neighborhood has been key for the Jackson Medical Mall's Foundation's exploration of different methods of health and wealth building beyond the mall's boundary. So we had things, for instance, like a weekly mobile art station traveling around the Prosperity Street neighborhood on Saturday afternoons, facilitated art making sessions led by teaching artists using a problem-based learning methodology, which focuses on the individual and their own interests and ideas, one-on-one consultations with artists, and the Jackson Medical Mall Foundation art programming, including workshops, performances, and multi-day camps. And part of that was to create greater community engagement with the changes that were going to happen and were happening around the Jackson Medical Mall, and their desire to create a sort of pool of prosperity around that area. So there's a number of these strategies sort of included in there. It is true that from a distance, it is very difficult to find and maintain the physical materials, the non-digital materials that are used in community building and community making. There is probably a lot of great materials in our sort of the zine collection at the KU library, because a lot of those were circulated around community issues sometime in the past. I'm really happy to help if anybody has any other questions. I will say, though COVID has made things much harder, I think it has increased people's desire for meaningful labor. And that is really the heart of what we do, the heart of what you do, and the heart of what artists hope to do as well.